Support the author with your activity so that there are more such videos. Thanks you. By the time the firemen pulled what was left of Harold Baines out of the crawl space, the town of Merowick had already decided what the story was. A faulty heater, an old house, an old man who forgot to turn something off. That was how Merowick preferred its tragedies. Simple, mechanical, nobody's fault. The house stood on Alder Row, a narrow street of near-identical homes built after the war. Modest porches, clipped hedges, American flags that only came out on holidays. Harold Baines had lived there alone since his wife died in '52, long enough for the neighbors to stop checking in and start waving from a distance instead. The fire itself had been small. Too small, some thought, to kill a man. But the smoke had filled the crawl space beneath the house, thick and slow, creeping like a living thing. Harold had been found face down, his hands clawed into the dirt floor, fingernails broken. The official report would later say asphyxiation. The coroner would note mild burns to the lungs. Nothing unusual for a house fire. What the report did not explain was why the heater had been disconnected from the gas line entirely. Sheriff Wallace Keene arrived late, his cruiser kicking gravel as it stopped. He was a big man with a permanent squint, the result of too many years driving into Midwestern sunrises. He walked the perimeter, nodded at the fire chief, accepted the explanation without argument. Merowick didn't need another mystery. It needed reassurance. By noon, the body was gone. By evening, the town was already forgetting. Except for one thing. Mrs. Evelyn Porter, who lived across the street, told anyone who would listen that she had seen someone leave Harold's house the night before the fire. A man, she thought, or maybe a woman. She couldn't be sure. It was dark, and she'd been watching television. The sheriff listened politely and wrote nothing down. People always saw things after the fact. What Mrs. Porter didn't say, what she kept to herself, was that the figure hadn't hurried. No panique, no ruse, just a calm walk down Alder Row, as if leaving their own home. Across town, in a narrow kitchen that smelled of coffee and lemon soap, Calder Hale folded the morning paper with deliberate care. "Page 3, he said quietly. Lorna Hale looked up from the sink. "Already. They kept it small," Calder replied. "Just like we hoped." Lorna dried her hands and came to the table, standing behind him as he read the article again. "Local man dies in house fire. No photograph. No questions. Just a name and an explanation." She placed her hands on his shoulders, not affectionately, not coldly, but with practiced familiarity. "He didn't suffer long," she said. Calder nodded. He had checked. He always checked. Outside, Merowick went on with its day. Children rode their bikes past Alder Row. A new family toured the empty house with a real estate agent before sunset. The crawl space had already been sealed. No one noticed the small detail that would have mattered later. The heater had been turned on by hand, hours after the gas was cut. And no one at all, understood yet that this had not been an accident, nor a moment of carelessness, but the first careful step in a pattern that would stretch across years, across towns, and across bodies that would never again be counted as simply unlucky. Merowick slept well that night. It still believed fires happen on their own. Calder Hale had learned early how to disappear in plain sight. He owned Hale's Appliance and Repair on Main Street, a narrow shop wedged between a barber and a closed-down five and dime. Washers, radios, refrigerators, anything with wires or valves eventually passed through his hands. People trusted men who fixed what was broken. They invited them into basements, kitchens, crawl spaces. They turned their backs. Calder was 42 in 1957, tall, without being imposing, his dark hair already thinning at the crown. He dressed conservatively, spoke little, listened well. Veterans liked him because he never asked about the war. Women liked him because he was polite and never stared. Men liked him because he minded his own business. No one noticed that Calder remembered layouts, where the gas line ran, which floorboards creaked, which houses had crawl spaces large enough for a man to move inside. He told himself he'd always been like that. Observant. Careful. Lorna had taught him the rest. She worked at the Merowick Public Library, a limestone building that smelled of dust and paste. Lorna Hale had a face people forgot quickly. Brown hair pinned tight, glasses with thin metal frames, clothes chosen for practicality, not style. She smiled when required and spoke softly enough that people leaned in. She knew things. Who borrowed which books? Who asked about estate planning? Who spent long afternoons reading alone? She knew which widowers refused help and which ones secretly wanted company. She knew routines. Lorna was 39, 3 years younger than Calder, and had been married once before to a man whose name she no longer used and whose body lay in a pauper's grave 2 counties over. Officially, he drowned while fishing alone in 1949. The river had taken him. Rivers did that. Calder had met her 2 years later when she brought a radio into his shop. It didn't need fixing. She knew that. He realized it halfway through dismantling it, but by then she was already watching his hands. "You're very thorough," she'd said. It wasn't flirtation. It was recognition. Their marriage looked unremarkable. No children, no church gossip, no raised voices heard through walls. They lived in a modest house near the rail line, ate dinner at 6, went to bed at 10. Calder read manuals. Lorna read psychology texts disguised under dust jackets of romance novels. They never spoke about why, only about how. The night before Harold Baines died, Calder had checked the heater twice. Lorna had watched the street. Timing mattered. Control mattered. What happened afterward mattered most of all. That morning, after the paper was folded and the dishes were done, they sat across from each other in silence. "Did you feel it?" Lorna asked finally. Calder considered the question. He always did. "Relief," he said. "Clarity." She nodded. "Good. That means it worked. What about you?" Lorna smiled just slightly. It confirmed something. They did not toast. They did not celebrate. What they felt was not excitement. It was alignment. They chose the second man because he believed in doors. Arthur Rellin was the kind of person who locked everything, front door, back door, shed, even the trunk of his car when it sat in his own driveway. He trusted mechanisms, not people. That made him predictable. Arthur lived in Brookvale, a town 40 miles east of Merriwick, close enough to feel familiar and far enough to feel anonymous. He was 56, unmarried, and worked nights as a supervisor at a grain mill. During the day, he slept. In the evenings, before his shift, he walked to the same diner and ordered the same meal. Meatloaf, black coffee, no dessert. Lorna learned this from the library's inter-town exchange logs. Arthur requested technical manuals, lock mechanisms, home security guides, outdated but meticulous. He liked to understand systems, so he could trust them. Calder liked that too. They drove to Brookvale on a Thursday, late enough that no one questioned unfamiliar faces. Calder carried a toolbox. Lorna carried a clipboard with blank paper clipped neatly on top. They knocked just after 7. Arthur opened the door only a few inches, chains still latched. "Yes." "Appliance recall," Calder said calmly. "Manufacturer's inspection. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. Lorna lifted the clipboard, offered a polite, professional smile. No pressure, no urgency. Arthur hesitated. People like him always did. But the box looked right. The words sounded official enough. He unlatched the chain. Inside, the house smelled of oil and old carpet. Everything was in its place. Arthur led them to the basement, talking about a washing machine he'd bought in '51 and never trusted since. Calder listened. He always listened. The basement was unfinished, concrete walls, one small window near the ceiling. Calder knelt by the machine, asked Arthur to turn it on. The noise filled the room. Lorna stood behind Arthur. She used the hammer because it was fast and because Arthur would not scream loudly enough to matter. One strike behind the ear. Not enough to kill him. Enough to drop him. Calder shut the machine off. They worked efficiently. A rope, a plastic sheet, tools already cleaned before they were ever used. Arthur regained consciousness once. His eyes found Calder's. "I did everything right," Arthur whispered. Calder did not answer. They staged it carefully. The washing machine's wiring was tampered with. A bucket of water tipped just enough to suggest carelessness. Arthur's body was positioned where a fall made sense. By the time they left, the house looked like it had always looked. Arthur Rellin was found the next morning, electrocuted by his own machine. The police called it an accident caused by faulty wiring and improper grounding. The report was signed off within hours. 2 deaths. 2 explanations. No connection. They did not return home immediately. Instead, they stopped at a roadside diner halfway back, ordered pie, drank coffee. Lorna watched other couples talk about nothing important. Calder noted the exits. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "Neither did you," she replied. They were no longer proving something to themselves. They were refining it. By the third death, Lorna was bored with accidents. "People expect them," she said, flipping through her notebook one evening. "They explain too much." Calder looked up from the kitchen table, where he was reassembling a toaster. "Then what do they expect less?" "Choice," Lorna replied, intent without violence. She had already selected the town. Graydon, Iowa, sat along a slow river and prided itself on being orderly. Its population hovered just under 6,000. The mayor's face appeared in the paper more often than the crime blotter. People there liked to believe they were careful. Margaret Klein lived alone in a white clapboard house near the water. She was 48, divorced, and worked as a clerk in the county records office. No enemies, no vices, no pets. She took long baths in the evening and read in bed afterward. Lorna knew this because Margaret borrowed books about sleep disorders and relaxation techniques from the library's regional catalog. Lorna also knew that Margaret suffered from migraines and kept prescription medication in a tin beside her bed. "What if we don't touch her at all?" Lorna asked. Calder understood immediately. "We adjust the conditions." They arrived in Graydon on a Sunday afternoon, when most people were at church. Calder wore a shirt with a stitched logo, Midwest Utilities. It had taken weeks to acquire. Lorna carried a canvas bag with gloves, labels, and a screwdriver. Margaret opened the door after the second knock. "City inspection," Calder said. "Gas and water. We notified the block last week." Margaret frowned, but stepped aside. People like her didn't want trouble. They wanted things handled. The house was clean. Too clean. Calder noted the gas stove, the small water heater, the bathroom window cracked open. Lorna moved through the bedroom quietly while Calder distracted Margaret with explanations that sounded just technical enough to be dull. Lorna swapped 2 bottles in the tin. Same shape, same color, different contents. They left within 15 minutes. That night, Margaret ran a bath. She took the pills Lorna had altered, expecting relief. The mixture slowed her breathing, dulled her awareness. When the gas from the stove seeped in, barely noticeable, a faint sweetness, Margaret didn't react. She was found the next morning, still in the tub. The window was open. The stove had been left on low. The medical examiner ruled it accidental, a tragic combination of medication misuse and carbon monoxide exposure. The newspaper used the word unfortunate. But this time, something lingered. The deputy who responded to the scene noted the pill bottles. Same labels. Same dates. He thought it odd that Margaret, known for being meticulous, had mixed them up. He mentioned it to his superior. Nothing came of it. Calder read about the death 2 days later. He felt a tightening in his chest. Not fear, but awareness. Someone noticed, he said. Lorna closed her notebook. They always do, eventually. They were no longer hiding inside accidents. They were hiding inside choice. The 4th death was the first one that paid. Lorna had resisted the idea at first. Money complicated things. Paper trails, questions, motivation. Those were the cracks investigators liked to pry open. But Calder understood leverage. Understood that people who expected nothing lost nothing. The man's name was Elwood Ferris. Elwood lived in Norwood, Indiana, a rail town slowly dying as freight routes shifted west. He owned 3 properties, all inherited, all poorly maintained, all fully insured. He rented rooms to seasonal workers and kept meticulous financial records, which he reviewed every Friday night with a bottle of bourbon and the radio tuned to baseball. Lorna found him through probate notices. Calder liked him because he never deviated from routine. They approached him honestly, almost. Calder responded to a classified ad Elwood had placed seeking a repairman to inspect an aging furnace. Lorna came along to take notes. Elwood welcomed them with the relief of a man who feared expensive surprises. The furnace was ancient. Calder told the truth about that. He also told Elwood he could fix it cheaply if the man was willing to wait a few days for parts. "I don't like delays," Elwood said. No one does, Calder replied. That night, Calder returned alone. Elwood was drunk enough not to notice the change in the air until it was too late. Calder didn't rush. He shut the doors, sealed the vents, adjusted the pilot. He watched Elwood slump forward in his chair, glass shattering on the floor. This death was quieter than the others. They waited 2 weeks before the fire. The blaze took one property, then jumped to the second. The third was spared, just enough loss to justify the insurance payout without raising immediate suspicion. Elwood's death was ruled accidental. The fire, electrical. Lorna handled the paperwork through a series of shell claims and intermediaries. Nothing led directly back to them. The money arrived slowly, then all at once. They used it to upgrade. Better tools, better disguises, a second vehicle, but money left fingerprints of its own. An insurance adjuster in Norwood questioned the timing. A bank clerk flagged an unfamiliar account. A state investigator added the case to a growing folder labeled Unusual Domestic Fatalities. The deaths were no longer isolated. They were adjacent. Sheriff Keene received a call from Indianapolis requesting copies of reports. He complied, irritation clear in his voice. You're seeing ghosts, he said. The man on the other end disagreed. Calder sensed the shift before Lorna admitted it. They're talking now, he said. Yes, Lorna replied, which means we have time. But time, Calder knew, was no longer something they controlled. It was something being counted. The man who noticed the pattern did not arrive with certainty. He arrived with irritation. Thomas R. Halvorsen had been a military police investigator in Korea, the kind of assignment that taught men to distrust clean explanations. In 1962, he worked out of the Indiana State Police Field Office, reviewing cases nobody else wanted, insurance anomalies, repeat fatalities, reports that didn't quite argue for themselves. He did not believe in serial killers. Not yet. The term barely existed outside academic circles. What he believed in was habit. For deaths over 5 years. Different towns. Different causes. But the victims shared something small and telling. They were alone, methodical, and accustomed to routine. More importantly, each death had occurred within weeks of documented home inspections, repairs, or clerical visits. Halvorsen laid the reports side by side on his desk. Fire, electrocution, carbon monoxide, gas poisoning, different methods, same intimacy. He drove to Merowick first, because it was the oldest case in the quietest town. Quiet towns hid things better. Sheriff Wallace Keene did not appreciate visitors from a state. He tolerated Halvorsen the way one tolerated bad weather. You're chasing coincidence, Keene said, leaning back in his chair. Old men die. Appliances fail. Houses burn. Halvorsen nodded. And sometimes people learn how to make them do that. He walked Alder Row that afternoon. Not looking for evidence. There wasn't any, but for access. Crawl spaces. Basements. Gas meters placed conveniently out back. He took notes. Mrs. Evelyn Porter recognized him immediately. Outsiders always stood out. You hear about Harold? She asked. Halvorsen stopped. Why do you ask? Because no one else ever was. She told him about the figure she'd seen that night. Calm, unhurried. Halvorsen wrote it down this time. Back in Merowick, Lorna noticed the unfamiliar car first. State plates, she said quietly. Calder didn't look up from his workbench. How long? 2 hours. They adjusted immediately. No more travel together. No more repeat disguises. Calder stopped taking out-of-town jobs. Lorna requested a transfer to cataloging, reducing her contact with patrons. But withdrawal itself created shape. Halvorsen's next stop was Brookvale, then Graydon, then Norwood. In each town, he asked the same dull questions. In each town, someone remembered a man with tools, a woman with papers. Not enough for warrants. Enough for suspicion. The break came from an object no one thought mattered. In Graydon, Halvorsen requested evidence photographs from Margaret Klein's bathroom. One image showed the medicine tin open on the counter. The labels were identical, but the caps were not. Manufacturers changed designs in batches. Those 2 caps came from different production years. Someone had handled them. Halvorsen circled the photograph in red pencil. By the time Calder realized the danger had matured, it was already too late to disappear. The fifth attempt was never meant to happen. Lorna had said it clearly, one more than silence. No profit, no experimentación, just closure, whatever that meant to people like them. Calder agreed, though agreement felt thinner now, stretched by weeks of watching unfamiliar cars pass their house and by the knowledge that Halvorson's questions were no longer drifting. They were narrowing. They chose Clara Whitcomb because she was careless. Clara lived outside Fairview, Illinois, on a property surrounded by scrubland and cornfields. She was 51, recently widowed, and ran a boarding house for traveling salesmen. Strangers came and went. No one would remember faces clearly. Clara trusted people too easily. She kept her back door unlocked during the day and slept with the radio on at night. Lorna found her through county lodging records. Calder visited once, alone, posing as a refrigerator repairman. He noted the layout, the weak locks, the shallow crawl space beneath the kitchen. What Calder didn't note was the dog. It was old, half-blind, and mostly quiet, but it recognized routines as well as any human. When Calder returned 2 nights later with Lorna waiting in the car, the dog barked. Once. Then again. Calder froze. Inside, Clara turned down the radio. "Hello," she called. They could have left. Calder knew that. He hesitated for only a second too long. Lorna slipped inside through the back door, while Calder distracted the dog with a piece of meat laced with sedative. It should have worked. The dosage was correct. But fear changed things. Clara saw Lorna in the hallway and screamed. Not loudly, but sharply, the sound of someone who understood danger before it fully arrived. Lorna struck her with a flashlight, harder than planned. Clara fell, hit her head on the doorframe. Dead instantly. Nothing about it was clean. They staged it hastily. Too hastily. The boarding house showed signs of struggle. A chair overturned. Blood on the baseboard that Calder missed in the dark. Worse, someone had seen the car. A farmhand on the neighboring property reported an unfamiliar vehicle idling near the house after midnight. He couldn't describe the driver, but he remembered the color, the shape. Halvorson received the report 3 days later. This time, the pattern snapped into focus. A vehicle registration search turned up a match within 20 miles of Merowick. A second vehicle, purchased recently, partially funded through an insurance payout tied to Norwood. Names surfaced. Jaldat Hale, Lorna Hale. The warrants were signed quietly. The arrest came at dawn. No sirens. No shouting. Just men at the door, guns drawn, voices steady. Lorna didn't resist. Calder looked once at the hallway where their coats hung, where everything had once felt controlled. Then he raised his hands. The search of the Hale residence began as a formality. State police entered the house on Rail Line Road, expecting paperwork, perhaps a ledger or correspondence tying Calder to the repair visits. What they found instead forced them to slow down, to treat the house not as a residence, but as a container. The crawlspace was discovered by accident. A junior investigator noticed that the access panel beneath the pantry had been resealed with newer screws than the surrounding wood. Calder's tools were lined up in the garage with obsessive care, but the screws didn't match the rest of the house. Someone had been there recently. They opened it at 9:40 a.m. Inside, the crawlspace was larger than expected, extending beneath most of the house. The dirt floor showed signs of disturbance. Compressed areas where weight had been placed repeatedly. There were boards laid across the soil to keep shoes clean. Then they found the boxes. 3 wooden crates, each labeled in pencil with dates instead of names. Inside were personal effects. Men's watches, a pair of horn-rimmed glasses, a woman's bathrobe folded with care, prescription bottles with scratched-off labels, a burned fragment of upholstery fabric. In the far corner, wrapped in oilcloth and buried shallowly, were bone fragments. Not complete remains, just enough. Teeth, a section of jaw, a finger bone with a ring still attached. Halvorson arrived within the hour. He did not touch anything. He only looked, then closed his eyes briefly, as if confirming something he had known long before proof existed. In the garage, behind a false panel, they found Lorna's notebook. No names, no towns. Just dates, methods, and short observations. Gas dispersal effective under low ventilation. Noise control adequate with external distraction. Witness risk increases with animals. It read like an instruction manual. Calder was questioned first. He answered politely, correcting small factual errors in the detective's assumptions. He never denied involvement. He simply reframed it. They were accidents, he said. We only arranged the conditions. Lorna said nothing for 3 days. When she did speak, it was not to confess, but to clarify. She corrected timelines. She explained why some methods were abandoned. She took responsibility for the planning. He executed, she said calmly. I designed. The prosecutors would later argue about dominance, influence, shared culpability. None of it mattered. The evidence was overwhelming. When the newspapers finally printed their names, the shock came not from the crimes, but from the ordinariness of the faces in the photographs. Merriwick held its breath. The case moved forward under a single name, chosen by the press before the courts could object. The domestic fatalities case. The trial began in the spring of 1965 in a county courthouse built to look permanent in a town that had never expected permanence to be tested. People lined up before dawn, not out of anger, not even curiosity, but confusion. They wanted to see the Hales in person, to reconcile the faces they knew from Main Street with the photographs printed beneath words like premeditated and multiple counts. Calder Hale wore the same gray suit every day. He sat straight, hands folded, expression neutral. Lorna dressed more carefully, pressed skirts, clean blouses, hair pinned as it had always been. She took notes during testimony, occasionally whispering to her attorney, correcting him when he misstated a detail. The prosecution did not begin with emotion. They began with sequence. A timeline stretched across the courtroom wall, connecting towns, dates, and methods. One by one, witnesses filled in the spaces, insurance adjusters, deputies, coroners, clerks. Each testimony was unremarkable on its own. Together, they formed something undeniable. Halvorsen testified on the 4th day. He spoke plainly, without theatrics, describing how patterns emerged only when someone was willing to ignore explanations and look at repetition instead. He presented the photograph of the mismatched pill caps. He explained how utility access, repair schedules, and library records intersected. Accidents don't adapt, he said. People do. The defense tried to fracture the narrative. They argued coincidence, professional exposure, overreach by investigators hungry for meaning. They suggested Lorna was a domineering influence. They suggested Calder was a passive participant. Neither argument survived scrutiny. Then came the evidence from the crawlspace. The courtroom was silent as items were displayed. The bathrobe identified by Margaret Klein's sister, the watch traced to Arthur Rell Lynn, the ring removed from the finger bone matching Elwood Ferris estate records. When Lorna's notebook was read aloud, she closed her eyes, not in shame, but in irritation, as if the words had been mishandled. Calder did not react at all. After 3 weeks, the jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. Under Indiana law at the time, the sentence for multiple premeditated murders was mandatory. The judge did not raise his voice when he spoke it. Death by electrocution. Lorna nodded once, as if confirming an outcome she had already calculated. Calder exhaled slowly, the way a man does when a long task is finally complete. Outside, the crowd dispersed quietly. There were no cheers, no relief, only the dull recognition that something had lived among them, unseen, and had only been named after it was gone. They were held in separate facilities, as procedure required, though no one believed separation would undo what had already been done. Calder Hale was transferred to the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City. Lorna was sent to the women's unit at the same complex, housed in a different wing, her days governed by bells and counts and silence that no longer needed to be managed. They were allowed to write once a week. Calder wrote twice. The first letter was logistical. Questions about property disposition, clarification on whether the house on Rail Line Road would be seized or sold. The second letter was shorter, written 2 months before his execution date. We finished what we started. That matters. Lorna never replied. In the weeks leading up to his execution, Calder declined spiritual counsel. He spoke politely with guards, corrected a chaplain on a technical detail regarding electrical currents, and spent his evenings reading appliance manuals sent from the prison library. On the morning of August 14th, 1966, Calder dressed himself carefully. He asked only one question, whether the equipment had been tested. "Yes," the warden said. "That's good," Calder replied. Failure ruins things. At 12:01 a.m., the switch was thrown. The newspapers reported it the next day in a column no longer than his obituary would have been. Lorna's execution followed 6 weeks later. Unlike Calder, she requested counsel. Not for forgiveness, but for conversation. She spoke at length about systems, how people trusted structures because they needed to believe order existed, even when it didn't. Their mistake, she said calmly, was assuming accidents are random. She walked to the chair without resistance. Just before the hood was placed, she asked that her glasses be removed and folded properly. A guard complied. Her last words were not defiant. "They noticed us," she said. Eventually, the case files were sealed for 20 years. Merriwick changed slowly. Hale's Appliance and Repair was sold, renamed, and eventually torn down. The house on Rail Line Road stood empty for a decade before a family from Ohio moved in, unaware of what lay beneath the replaced flooring. Sheriff Keene retired early. Halvorson took on fewer cases, none of them small-town accidents. Years later, criminology students would study the domestic fatalities case as an early example of paired offenders without a single signature, killers who understood that the safest place to hide was inside normality. The official conclusion was brief. The defendants exploited trust, routine, and infrastructure. No supernatural factors were involved, but the towns remembered it differently. They remembered that fires still burned, machines still failed, and gas still leaked, but never again without someone wondering, quietly, whether it had truly happened on its own. And that, perhaps, was the only thing the Hales left behind that could not be buried.